Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space.
As a consumer of software, and with all the stuff that is there around us, all the API-centric stuff, and all the cool stuff with AI and everything else that is there, we as consumers should be shocked if that time doesn't compress dramatically, because there's tons of technology at our disposal to build what we need to build pretty quickly, because building has been extremely democratized. Nobody needs to know how to write a line of code to build something, to build an application anymore. So you can do a lot of stuff very quickly.
Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. This episode, Ninad and I welcome Udai Tennati, Technical Vice President at Manhattan Associates. Udai is a supply chain software application expert with an impressive track record that's closing in on 24 years at Manhattan. I think, Udai, you're 1 month away from that 24-year mark, where he leads global teams that deliver essential product suites. He's dedicated his career to enhancing end user experiences, making supply chain processes smoother and more efficient. On a personal note, Udai is also passionate about making a positive impact in the community. He's played a key role in establishing the Atlanta Chapter of Asha for Education. Udai, it's an absolute pleasure to have you join us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dan and Nath.
Thank you. And just a side note for folks listening, I've known Udai since 2008. As you heard, his role has been in professional services, implementing Manhattan solutions, and that's where my career kind of started, I should say. And Udai was someone that I really looked up to throughout my entire career. So I'm super excited to have Udai on the pod today.
Thank you. Thanks, Anand. Same here. Looking forward to it.
So maybe to get started, and again, if you look at Udai's LinkedIn, you'll see he's 1 month away from 24 years at Manhattan. And with that much of experience, would love to hear, what it was almost 24 years ago that attracted you to the logistics space. And what is it about the space that's kept you here this whole time? Sharing any career highlights that come to mind.
Yeah, sure, Dan. I think, like a lot of people, I kind of backed into my job.
Yeah.
Most of us are not trained to do what we do on a day-to-day basis. So I was in my grad school at Ohio State, finishing up my master's program in operations research. And I had this opportunity to continue my research work and go on to be, a doctoral dissertation, stay on that track or get some industry experience. I chose the latter. And coming out in 99, there were a handful of supply chain companies which kind of overlap with the operations research space that I worked in. And for, I would say, not very fancy reasons, just the weather and the climate in Atlanta, I chose Manhattan on a whim. My hope was that by working here, I would actually find a real-world problem in the supply chain space where I could go back and do some deep research, have a real doctoral thesis on it. And almost 24, 25 years later, I think I'm still searching. So, so the intention was never to make this a full-time career choice, but it just turned out to be the right place, the right fit. And supply chain space is a wonderful space to work in. So,
absolutely. And, just to kind of dive into that career journey as well, right? Like talking about Manhattan itself, you got about 10 more years on me when it comes to just experience with Manhattan, let alone just the fact leadership position and looking at the details and strategic decisions being made over there. How has WMS evolved? Because I've seen, I started with the 2006-7 version of the application, right? And that's what you get to see. And it's not just about Manhattan, but what has your experience been from, let's say, 99 to at this point, the evolution from a technology standpoint, as well as from a, the user standpoint? Like, how has it evolved? Like, and what were the key drivers for that evolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So clearly the the WMS space predates, my start with Manhattan. I mean, it's been there since the mid 80s. It's evolved quite a bit over that time. But I would say for the most part, from a technology perspective, the supply chain industry has stayed in lockstep with the times. The one thing that people don't realize, especially Manhattan operates, I would say, in a very narrow slice of the supply chain, mainly on the execution end. So there's the four walls of the warehouse, all the transportation systems around it. And of late, all the order management space that drives orders into either the stores or the distribution centers. So we work in a highly transactional environment. For most companies, it's like the beating heart of their business. So people usually are fairly reluctant to make changes in this space. Changes done very infrequently. So there's a premium that is put on the kind of technology that's used and the reliability of that technology and the resilience of that technology, right? So if I look back in 99 when we were doing this stuff, it was not unusual to think that the most reliable piece of technology around then was mainframe systems, because it was being used in the financial sector, banking sector, and all other, slew of other verticals as well. And that's essentially what WMSs were built on. So there was a whole lot of mainframe technology around in the marketplace. Then as our consumer software and enterprise class software evolved towards the newer technologies, where we had a more distributed architecture and, the old client server architecture and having 3-tier architecture with the app, the server, and the database there. That kind of technology kind of drifted into the WMS space as well. So same thing with Manhattan, we kind of evolved our product to, operate in that multi-tier architecture, which was not totally reliant on, mainframe systems. And that we did for, I'd say, a good part of the middle of 2000s all the way until like 2018, 2019, right? And I think we all as consumers, early in the, I would say 2010s and late 2010s and around that time frame, we got to this whole, cloud-based consumption model for all of our applications, stuff in our day-to-day life, etc. And that kind of drifted over to enterprise software as well. There were only probably a handful of companies that built enterprise class, built in the cloud applications. If Ninad and I were asked back in 2010 to bet our salary, we would have said, hey, WMS is going to be the last thing that moves to, the cloud.
Yes, sir.
The technology has proven itself out. It runs, all kinds of things these days, all kinds of applications run on the public cloud infrastructure. What happened in between was the customers themselves who are used to running compute, all the iron that they bought to run, whatever supply chain systems and other systems that used to sit on-prem in their data centers, that started drifting out. Right? So the first step was, hey, I'm going to move all this iron out, I'm going to put it in some lease-oriented space where somebody else is going to carry and feed for it. That was step number one. Once you had gotten past that barrier and you knew that you were not carrying and feeding for it as a company, then the next evolution was to say that, hey, this piece of iron now sits in some public cloud, which is, run by Google or AWS or Azure. So the leap of faith there was not that large, because most technologists, most consumers of software saw that, hey, this thing actually scales and the response times are really great and it's highly resilient and it can, adapt to the supply chain world needs as well. So that's where we ended up, right? So our evolution as a company has been through that too, from the mainframe to kind of that distributed computing architecture to now in the cloud kind of architecture, right? So
that's, I remember back in the days, the biggest concern that people would throw around was information security, right? Yeah, and I think these public clouds very quickly proved that their information architecture or information security architecture and their posture was much stronger than almost anything they could come up with from an enterprise grade, like, run your own data center type of solution or iron, the bare metal that they were running, right? That was like one of the barriers. Once we kind of crossed that threshold, then it was all gravy. Then it's let's go, right? So
yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, the other aspect was the security aspect, right? And I think any of us, if you had to run a service, and we want a lot of consumers to use our service. And in this example, it's a compute service. We want to make sure that the service that we are providing is reliable and secure.
Yeah.
Right? So it's in the best interest of the Googles and the Azures of the world and the AWSs to not only provide a world-class service, but also make sure the service is secure. So they're incented just as much as everyone else. I think once we as individuals and consumers made that leap, the leap of taking our enterprise class technology that we were using in our day-to-day jobs and saying that, hey, that runs in a public cloud was not that large of a leap of faith, right?
Exactly. And I also think within the warehousing space, one of the concerns in specifically high performance warehouses where there is MHE systems that are running on sub-second transaction times, right? Like you got diverts that need to have decision making that's within a second or 3 seconds or whatnot, right? I think that was also another set of challenge within our space as well. That was like, hey, can you actually give the throughput and the performance that's necessary from the system running off a cloud? Because, and again, the company's bust now, so I can speak to it personally. Target Canada, I was running an entire data center in each one of my 3 sites, right? Like a physical data center inside the site for the purposes of speed and performance. And today I feel confident I could do that entire thing in the cloud, right?
That's true. I mean, few and far between are companies like Target and, pick your other very large big box company that can run compute in every warehouse. I think most consumers of enterprise class software don't have that luxury. So when we think of latency, right, there's many levels to the onion. One is just getting out of my 4 walls, which is my network. Then the public infrastructure that I'm going to ride on, which is going to get to some data center, whether it's mine or managed or a public infrastructure where, that software might sit. And then what the software itself is doing.
Yeah.
Right. So there are many layers to the onion. And of course, the easiest thing for us as consumers or as any consumer of software is to say, hey, I want to cut all these layers of the onion out. And the only way to do that is, as Ninad said, you take the iron and put it in your warehouse.
Exactly.
Not everybody has that luxury, right? So, but it is, and each one of these hubs have been getting tremendously better, and there have been exponential improvements. So, and we see that. It's not just supply chain software, right? Everything that we use, kind of runs in these public clouds. And at the end, it's all about results.
Exactly. And talking about bare metal in the warehouses, I got to tell you one story. One of the retailers, not naming names, over $5 million in capital equipment, a sortation unit that's running. The PLC controller, the controls mechanism, the server itself wasn't in a data center. It was literally on the warehouse floor as a general CPU just sitting under the desk of the ops supervisor. No redundancy, no nothing. The damn thing just kept running, So, you see all sorts of, you see the spectrum of how people have deployed the solution. And I'm glad cloud is here. And true native cloud. And maybe Udai getting into that, right? So the journey was first take what we have and put it in the cloud.
Yeah.
It's evolving, right?
Yeah, there was I would say a very minor step for us while we were making this transition to build a completely cloud native software. So I think, the one thing that Manhattan has done, which, I'm extremely proud of being a part of the company, is it's easy to kind of plow the line that you actually are on and keep at it when things are good. But to be actually able to see that, hey, there's a change coming and have the guts to actually say that, hey, we're going to start from scratch and build something that is completely cloud native. So the fact that it's not just cloud native, not just any sort of cloud native, right? It can run on any public cloud. It's not actually dependent on any one of these 3 flavors of public clouds that are there. And it's just not taking our old software, any incarnation of our old software, putting some lipstick on it, saying that it will run it in a public cloud, care and feed for it, and kind of update it every ever so often. That's not what we did, right? We essentially fundamentally rethought about the app in terms of all the consumer grade apps that we, use on a day-to-day basis, whether it's Netflix or Facebook or whatever, right? They're truly cloud native, built in the cloud, visual as updates, new features and functions all the time. That's essentially what the Manhattan Active platform is all about, which is just incredibly cool to see.
Yeah. And by the way, and I've seen the Manhattan Active platform up close and personal. So I kind of know what it is and what it does. And I would say, I don't think there is a comparison in the market as far as a WMS is concerned, period, in the market, right? Like that you could say there is a true cloud native application that can have these capabilities. And the question I have around that is, how do leaders within the technical space that are responsible for managing WMSs think about this? Because if you look at the trend, it has always been the leaders in the WMS, the tier ones that take the step, build a capability, etc. And then there is the tier twos that are going to follow. I feel maybe it might take 10 years, it might take 15 years, it might take 5 years, but a lot of evolution is about to happen within the space with folks trying to mimic and do some of the things that Manhattan does. So there's got to be a general understanding of like, how should leaders that are responsible for implementing and leaders that are responsible for supporting these systems post-implementation should be thinking about it differently? What is the fundamental difference from a technical leadership perspective and, operational leadership standpoint? How should they?
So your question is more so from a consumption side?
Exactly.
That's a great question. So running your application in the cloud fundamentally changes a lot of things, right? I mean, a lot of the category feeding that you had to do is now being done by, in this case, Manhattan. So the big thing that we as Manhattan want to empower our consumers, our customers on is the ability to give that visibility to, what are the kind of operational nuances that you need to be monitoring. Because you have closer, I'd say about, eyeballs on, the full walls of the warehouse, on four walls of the supply chain, right? So give that visibility to the consumer, give them the tooling, all of that, so that, if and when there's a problem, that they can do the necessary diagnosis that needs to be done. And then in some cases where it cannot be, then, they have access to that, and folks to say that, hey, we are observing something in the system that we need immediate attention to. So this all falls under the broad umbrella of, traceability and, monitoring and alerting. And there's a lot of terms that are used for it. But really it is to empower our users to say that, hey, and there is a problem on the floor, I am able to actually diagnose that problem well ahead of, the operational user doing, experiencing it. I can, in some cases, fix it myself. And in other cases, I can make sure that I call the service provider and get their attention and, get the problem resolved. Now, the other aspect of this is, like any other, cloud-based application, it's all about data, right? So you have to think about a strategy where before you would have control over all the databases and you could do whatever you wanted with that data, slice and dice it any different way. It's a slightly different paradigm. Now you have to egress the data out and you have to figure out where you're going to store it and, what kind of analytics you're going to run on it, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's, kind of the second aspect of it. And not to miss the trick, as you pointed out, the most important thing is just making sure that you have secure access to the app, right? I mean, before, you would actually have your users set up a certain way, you would have temp users come in and out. But when you're using a public cloud application, just like any other enterprise class public cloud application, you want to make sure you secure your access, you have the right means of authenticating users, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a huge, in some cases, we found a huge shift in the supply chain space, right? Telling people that, hey, you need to think about how you're accessing this app, put an IDP in front of it.
Exactly.
Do your authentication, make sure you know who's in and out of the system, et cetera, right?
Absolutely. I also think, Udai, from a deployment standpoint, the talent pool shifts, right? Like before, the talent pool that we required, if I was to call out, I would say it was 70% functional, 30% technical resources to actually support the application, right? Like you needed functional resources, super users, floor staff users, etc., that had the talent of the application and understanding. And then you had the super technical folks that manage the backend databases, etc. Even though the shift happens towards cloudification, right, where Manhattan takes over the support or any cloud provider takes over the support, there is the part of deployment and management and change management of the application. I feel as we move more towards this microservice API-based architecture to truly utilize the application, I think the number flips. Am I right or wrong in my thinking on that? Where it is actually 70% technical resources and functional becomes 30, or techno-functional becomes 70% as you start shifting towards adopting more modern WMS type of environments?
And that is a good question. So I would say the mix doesn't change that dramatically, but it does change insofar that you want your users who are using the system, who are kind of in the middle between functional and technical, to be techno-functional in nature. And more so, I think the biggest thing that I've noticed, which is true about a lot of applications, is that you really need to be API savvy. Right? That's the common denominator really is, the ability to use APIs, to be well conversant with, all the tools and the technology and the power lines that comes along with it. That is the most important skill set that you can have as a consumer for, well-built cloud applications, right? Because if you look at Salesforce, if you look at Twitter, you look at Facebook, you look at anything. You look at OpenAI, they have an API. So as a consumer of software, as a consumer of technology, the number one thing I would equip myself with is the skill to deal with APIs. So use my tool of choice, whether it's curl or Postman or whatever it may be, be well versed with that tool and all the stuff, the ins and outs of using APIs, because the platform for most of these companies, Manhattan's included, is highly API centric.
Yep.
So if you're able to ask the right questions and you're well versed with that, you can be as dangerous as you want to be. Now, all the folks who used to care and feed for the application as far as deployment, and because you raised that point, at least in the Manhattan use case, deployment, tending of the iron, all of that is shifted to the Manhattan side, right? So we, in the case of our service that we provide, the supply chain services that we provide, we completely, it is a white glove service. So we take care of all the deployments, scheduling of the deployments, treating all the underlying, infrastructure is ours, the security is ours. So really we are counting on our users to use our service, configure our service, troubleshoot our service with the troubleshooting tools that we provide, monitor the service, use the data that's coming out from it, etc. Right?
And build extensions, right? Udai?
Yeah. And
we can build extensions now, right?
And the icing on the cake, really, as you pointed it out, rightfully, there is a whole tool, whole product. In fact, Proactive, it sits on the Manhattan Active platform, which is exclusively there just for building extensions. So if you are techno-functional, know how to use APIs, can do a little bit of TypeScript code, you can be extremely effective in writing extensions. Everything that Manhattan used to do in our prior incarnation, as far as being the sole adjudicator and proprietor for all things custom, now our consumers have the control of doing that stuff. So essentially enabled all that.
So one thing that listeners of this podcast that are current Manhattan user of old application, and they are super users, that you should take away is the chances are your job currently consists of using SQL all day long. And that's going to shift to APIs, because that's what I'm hearing from Udai right now, right? Like it's what you used to do with SQLs and you equipped yourself. I mean, I've seen operators, supervisors, everyone on the warehouse floor that had the basic skills necessary to execute SQLs, right? Like do read statements at least. We are going to now start seeing that from a API access standpoint that the users will have control over, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So all the stuff that we could do using SQLs directly on databases, which was in some cases not the right thing to do, you can now abstract out and do using APIs. So you can build composite service chains, which essentially achieve the same outcomes without actually hitting the database as heavily as it would have in the past with SQLs. So these out-of-the-box APIs that the platform provides, and the proactive tool which lets you stitch APIs together to build composite services, lets you do everything that you did in the past and a whole lot more. So as I said, being API, well-versed with APIs, being, technically savvy, not being scared of technology is a huge plus in this world.
That's amazing. And one thing that I just noticed is you called it a SQL, I call it SQL. I don't think the dust has yet settled on what it's supposed to be.
It's like there is a small subset of people who call SAP, and then the rest call it SAP.
Yep. And and there is the GIF and the GIF, right? I still don't know what that's supposed to be. Yeah, exactly.
Udai, I wanted to ask you, and maybe this is moving up 30,000 square feet or 30,000, I said square feet, that's warehouse ism I can't get out of my head. But wanted to ask you, we have a lot of conversations and we work with organizations that are searching for a WMS, or maybe they're looking to do an upgrade. And, obviously Manhattan, has been sitting at the top right of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for years and years, is known as a leader in the space, certainly from a tier 1 enterprise class solution, as you've mentioned. I think what would be interesting is to get your perspective on, when is it the right time to engage with Manhattan or any tier 1 type solution? We have conversations where maybe the facility is only 100,000 square feet and they don't think it's large enough or they don't have enough users. But then we've also seen facilities that are 500,000 square feet or more that don't have complexity or don't have a lot of users. So I think there can be a little education here with your experience on nodes in a network, size of facility, or the complexity of the needs of a retailer or brand as to kind of when they should be looking at different tiered solutions in the space, specific to like WMS.
No, that's a great question. The way I think about this, Manhattan Associates, and it may be a poor analogy, but it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, or it may be like that your favorite craftsman toolbox. So it's got like 8,000 tools in it, which can solve, any like problem that you want. You have a tool for that problem. I think of Manhattan WMS like that because the way it's built to tackle a whole lot of verticals, a whole lot of flavors of, supply chain problems. And let's focus. I think the question is more so specifically around the warehousing side. So when we deal with warehouses, there will be warehouses that actually do big box retail pushes, micro-plant pushes into stores that do e-commerce, and there could be stores there are warehouses that actually deal with high-tech stuff. There are ones that deal with pharmaceutical. There's the whole B2B flavor to it. There are deconsolidation DCs. There are consolidation DCs. There are third-party logistics companies. And we have a WMS, which caters to all of these nuances, right? So when you think about what is being packed into that product, there's a whole lot of complexity that's packed into that product and a whole lot of flexibility that's packed into that product. Now, I don't want to dissuade anybody who's got a very simplistic, kind of need from using a Manhattan WMS. But if I were a consumer of software, I would think long and hard about, hey, where does my use case actually warrant using something of that level of sophistication? Right. So I think we talked about this, before the call. Like I'm an accountant, or I'm running a small business. I could go and buy a fancy, state-of-the-art enterprise class accounting tool, but that may not be my need. Something as simple as Intuit, QuickBooks might solve my need. So there is a level of sophistication that the operation has, which would dictate using to the flexibility that Manhattan WMS provides. So it's not really the size of, your network, because you may be I don't want to use, any company's name, but you may have a very simple box in box out row. Yeah. Big boxes coming in, big boxes going out. You may have 50 such buildings spread all over the country, over many countries, but the flow is fairly simplistic. Now, does that warrant the level of sophistication that a Manhattan WMS may provide? May not be the case. You may have a very small 100,000 square foot building, which is packing a whole lot of complexity into it. You have 50 stores, you're pushing out your retail store push from there, you're doing e-com stuff, you're sending stuff over to, wholesalers, and you're trying to do all that within some 150,000 square foot facility. And you have packed some automation into it too. Maybe that building actually warrants using something more sophisticated than, a QuickBooks equivalent, right? So that's the way I think about it. So when you go to the operation, usually you can tell that level of complexity, whether it, kind of dictates having anything on the top right hand quadrant of the magic quadrant, right? I mean, it's not necessarily just Manhattan, but anything that is sitting up there, it comes with its own level of sophistication, needs and wants. The other thing that comes to mind is, there are very few such instances in play these days. But if you are in an environment where you don't use a WMS and you are going to put a WMS in place, the WMS or any WMS, not just Manhattan's WMS, is going to force you to operate, in a certain manner. Yep. There is not going to be all that flexibility to, just to move stuff around and have workarounds and all that. If you want to get from point A to point B to point C in your flow, it's going to be a very streamlined, methodical way to get there. So if you are not in that kind of business, then you don't pick not just a Manhattan WMS, but in, any sophisticated kind of WMS, right? Because once you get higher up the food chain in flexibility and complexity, those kind of systems actually force you to do things the right way for certain reasons. And that may not be my cup of tea. I may just say, the kind of product that I'm pushing out doesn't warrant that level of sophistication, process sophistication, right? So I'm sorry, it's not an easy answer, but I usually think about, when you look at does the business actually need this versus not? It has nothing to do with the size of the company, size of the network, how many buildings you have, how many users you have, none of that at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we see that all the time, Udai, right? Like where it's, you walk into the operation or you read the operational need, and we are actually in a WMS search. And there is someone in the leadership that in their past job, used one of the 2 or 3 tier 1 solutions that are out there. And they'll be like, yeah, we should bring in Manhattan. And I'm like, I don't think so, guys. Like, it's going to be really difficult for you to bring this in. And it requires a level of care and feeding. And it's not just the cost. It's also the manpower, the labor that goes into the management of an application like that, while you have a super simple, a perfect example. It's like box comes in and box leaves out flow. You don't really need it. But I also feel with the move to cloud, and maybe this is just my opinion, but I feel that with the move to cloud, the amount of people that could access tier 1, like Manhattan, is going to start opening up, because there is the part of managing the application. There is the part of implementing the application. There is the part of, right, like all of those costs are now becoming, I just need to do a simple math, whatever the licensing model be, right? But it's a simpler math. I could be highly complex 10 user operation and I can afford Manhattan. Right?
Yeah,
like it's shifting towards that direction as we look at cloud, because the cost to implement, or at least take away majority of the cost of like actually spinning up the instance, right? Like, every time I implemented Manhattan, it's like a month and a half of exercise of like installing the software and, a bunch of people fly in from all over and just make sure that the thing is doing what it needs to do. And all of that is gone, right? Like, I don't want to oversimplify, but it's like, click, spin up an instance, and bam, you go, right? Like the instance is ready.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, we are early in this journey. We as Manhattan and WMS in the cloud space. But I could foresee some future, maybe 7, 8, 10 years from now, similar to how enterprise ERP software and what Salesforce and some others have done to it, right? There could be a whole offshoot of ecosystem of companies that say, hey, we're going and want to simplify this whole process to use those tier 1 cloud WMS applications. We have all these allied services and widgets and technologies, which makes this whole, enablement process easier, and you can kind of onboard and run this thing much faster. So there's definitely a future for all that. I think we're very early on in the cycle, both from a deployment perspective, and we talked about extensions. That's early as well. But if you were to fast forward along the tracks of where some other enterprise class applications have ended up, there's a lot of white space here.
I've always looked at it as, I hear you, it's early, right? But I've also seen, I always like to compare this to Salesforce and the direction that Salesforce ended up going, and look at the ecosystem of external applications that solve these small problems, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Just much easier.
Yep.
Hopefully there is a little bit of expeditiousness on that side, because I got ideas.
Yeah, for sure, right? So there's definitely these answers will keep changing for sure.
It makes absolute sense.
So Udai, maybe going back to the implementation, I think, and you did that was a great response to the question, and the takeaway is, there's no clear answer. Every aspect has to be looked at and investigated. But one of the things that comes up as well too is it's not the concept, but the concept of professional services. So we know when someone is going with a tier 1 WMS, even a tier 2 WMS, there's a licensing fees, there's whatever costs associated with getting the platform and the solution up and running. But then there's the aspect of professional services. And I think a lot of organizations still kind of struggle with, maybe the simple question is, why is professional services needed? But once you get past that is, what % of resources for an implementation should be internal resources, or should be from the software provider themselves, or from an external partner? So, with your experience, any light or thoughts you could share on that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So you got to take whatever I say with a sack of salt.
Absolutely.
Because I'm on the services side, but I'll I'd say biased opinion. The way I look at this is, but just let's start from the back, right? So what are the resources that someone who's using the services needs to bring to bear? I would say a whole lot. I don't know what a whole lot is, but more than what is just, minimally brought to the table. Because you're buying a fairly sophisticated piece of software which can do, all kinds of things. So the more you understand about that piece of software or that piece of service and how you can configure it and all the tools that come along with it and all the widgets and all that, the better off you're going to be, right? Now, the other part of your question is, why do you need professional services? I'm assuming you're a part of that, onset part of that question is, why do you need professional services from Manhattan Associates? You need professional services just because of the fact that for that initial deployment, you need some help to understand all these nuances of configuration and what are the various decision filters that need to be applied. To be able to understand all that, to be able to build out a process to say that, hey, let's assume that you have more than one warehouse. What is the process that I'm going to follow to, that's even something as simple as accumulate all my configuration and move it from, my first instance to my second instance. How am I going to do that? What tools are available to me? To be able to train oneself on all those processes and tools, it's very important to have professional help, right? And I would be a very strong advocate to say that the customer, the consumer, brings as many people to bear, asks all the questions, puts as much calories and energy into that first deployment, so that they can extract as much as possible out of the first deployment, and then they're off and running on their own independently. From the second side onwards, assuming that you're dealing with a network of kind of distribution centers, and in this particular case, right? So there is that need. Now, where does that initial service then come from? That is up for debate, right? I mean, you can have third-party integrators, you can have the service provider themselves, like Manhattan in this case, bring the services to bear, professional services to bear. But there's no right answer for that. But you do need these people who know the software inside out to at least put you on the right path. And then you need to have the right people at the table. Like Ninad said, ask the question about, what kind of skill sets do I need to bring to bear? How many people or what kind of skill sets? And that answer changes, right? Because you may have a guy who's sitting in an ops kind of role who understands technology very well, is not scared of the SQL, SQL, app, service calls, whatever it may be. You want to bring those right amount of people to bear. But there's no way to avoid this fact that there is a piece of software, because we see that everywhere, right? Whether it's us, whether it's any ERP system, any kind of other financial system you put in place. Just to put that initial thing in place and configure it and understand all the nuances, you need some help.
From your vantage point, does the need for professional services, or maybe a broader, higher level question, the time to implement reduces with the move to cloud?
Absolutely. As a consumer of software, and with all the stuff that is there around us, all the API-centric stuff and all the cool stuff with the AI and everything else that is there, we as consumers should be shocked if that time doesn't compress dramatically, right?
Yeah.
Because there's tons of technology at our disposal to build what we need to build pretty quickly, because building has been extremely democratized. Yep. Nobody needs to know how to write a line of code to build something, to build an application anymore. Yep. So you can do a lot of stuff very quickly. And I would assume that over time, our expectations as consumers and consumers in the supply chain space should be the same. Yep. It should become much faster, much cheaper, much more efficient to definitely should shrink. Time to value should shrink.
Absolutely. No, that's phenomenal. And you touched on this, and this is kind of leaning into my last question, right? You touched on the AI side of things. What excites you in the next 5 to 10, right? Like, so we saw this cloud kind of coming. That was the 10-year. In 2010, we could see what direction all of this is kind of starting to shift. Where do you see things shift with generative, with digital twin simulation type capabilities? Like, what's getting you excited about like capabilities, features, functions within WMS over the next 5 to 10?
So the biggest thing that I'm personally excited about is the fact that, and Ninad, you know this well, so we would try to ferret out some little piece of information about, what's happening in the warehouse. Like, has this particular box been loaded onto that particular truck? And we would have a whole plethora of screens to go through. Truck number, order number, this, that, 15 different screens, finally to piece the answer for that particular question. What I think is going to happen, which is going to be really cool with all software, and especially WMS software, hopefully, once this AI thing gets cheap enough and the tokenization gets cheap enough, is that I can ask the question in my language of choice. I don't have to deal with all these screens, and it's going to provide me an answer. Right? I don't need to know screen navigation and the names of all these screens and the screens which change from one WMS to another, et cetera, et cetera. The user interface becomes immensely simpler.
Yeah.
That is the coolest thing from a consumer perspective, right? So if you think about the warehouse supervisor or the store supervisor and they want to know a certain piece of information or something critical, they just ask the question, and as opposed to all these screens that you navigate through. So fundamentally, as software users, the user interface that we have is going to be just a command line.
I wholeheartedly agree.
So all these calories that we spend about, I don't want to say UI design is not great, but we'll really think long and hard about how pretty does the UI need to be, because I just need to be able to communicate in my language of choice, and the software is going to respond to me. That is a brilliant leap. Yeah.
So I will say this, right? Just slight difference on that. I think the UX is a really important part of like giving me the right screens where I never need reports, right? Like in general, right? Like have me the right stuff at the right place. That's going to be needed. I think the one that takes the hit in line with what you're saying is actually BI. We have had the hoopla around big data and BI for the longest time, and reporting and analytics for the longest time, of having all of these dashboards and charts and graphs. Like, Udai, the amount of hours I've spent writing like custom charts to show me like wave plans and, where each wave is and what's not happening within the wave. Yeah. All of that's gone. I don't need it. Just tell me what I need to know. I myself am terrible at reading graphs and charts. Why do I need to read this stuff? Just tell me what I need to do my job correctly. Do I need to be educated? It's like an autopilot for you still need a pilot, right, to fly an airplane. But majority of the work is actually happening on autopilot. And I see the role of supervisors and operational leaders and general managers in facilities, etc., moving into, you need to have 5,000 hours of flying experience, right? But the WMS is doing majority of the work for you and telling you when you need to course correct or you need to make changes to achieve the goals that you have set in front of you. Like that's like that generative side. I think that is taking unstructured and structured data and then translating into something that's truly meaningful. And I shouldn't even be looking for that carton. I should know that carton's about to get lost if I don't do something about it, right? Like
that's true.
Yeah. So anyways,
you're right. So there's always going to be room for, those dashboards which tell us about progress. But the screens that we use for configuring any sort of software, the screens that tell us, all these inquiry screens that we have all over the place with softwares, enterprise, all those, then it's just not a WMS thing. Just not a supply chain thing. I think it's going to fundamentally change how we interact with this piece of machine, right, that we have in front of us, which is pretty cool.
I agree. And you know what, I'll leave you with one fun fact. Like for all the applications I've developed, there could be like crazy backend functionality that you develop. But when it comes time to sales demonstrations, the first thing they ask for is like, can we have a screen with a bunch of charts and graphs? And it's like, bro,
you always got that.
Can we show all the other cool stuff this does, right? Like, anyway.
So true. So true. Well, listen, Udai, the time is absolutely flown by. Want to thank you for joining us, and it's been an absolutely great conversation. But want to leave with you having an opportunity to share with the audience where they could go to learn more about Manhattan Associates if they don't already know, and any place you're active on social media where people could go to follow you.
Yeah, no, good. Thanks for the opportunity, Dan, Ninath. All Manhattan-related information can be found at www.manage.com. And then me personally, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the one place where I'm socially active. I've tried to stay away from the others for various different reasons, but you can find me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Ninath. Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Hi, I'm Ninath Acharya, CEO and co-founder of Fulfillment IQ, and I'm here with
Dan Call, CRO and partner at Fulfillment IQ. We're the team behind the Ecom Logistics podcast. Our mission is to provide you with genuine insights from our work alongside logistics leaders to help you improve your supply chain.
In the Ecom Logistics podcast, we share the knowledge and the insights we've gained from working alongside amazing brands, retailers, 3PLs, and VCs, so you can make the most out of your supply chain journey.
If you like what you're hearing, we'd truly appreciate your support with a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting channel. Your feedback not only keeps us going, but also helps others find the podcast. If you think Fulfillment IQ can assist you, or if you have an idea related to logistics, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat and ready to explore new possibilities together.
Stay tuned to the Ecom Logistics podcast on your favorite podcast platform for fresh and practical insights into e-commerce and logistics. Until next time, let's keep making a difference in logistics together.